the Sharia, to the law of Islam. And it is extending the Sharia into areas that never existed before. Second, it is at base, very deeply, a clash of civilizations ideology. It divides the world into two parts, the moral and the immoral, the good and the bad. Here's one quote from a British-based Islamist by the name of Abdullah Faisal, who was convicted and is now in jail. There are two religions in the world today, the right one and the wrong one. Islam versus the rest of the world. We don't get a more basic clash of civilization orientation than that. There's a hatred of the outside world, of the non-Muslim world, and the West in particular. There's an intent to reject as much as possible of outside influence. And the third feature is that this is totalitarian in nature. It turns Islam from a personal faith into an ideology, into an ism. It's the transformation of a personal faith into a system for ordering power and wealth. Radical Islam derives from Islam, but it is an anti-modern, millenarian, misanthropic, misogynist, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, triumphalist, jihadistic, terroristic, and suicidal version of it. It is Islamic-flavored totalitarianism. Like fascism and communism, all radical Islam shares that it is a compelling way of seeing the world. It is a way that can absorb an intelligent person and show him or her a whole new way of seeing life. It's radical utopian. It takes the mundane qualities of everyday life and turns them into something grand and glistening. It is an attempt to take over states. It is a use of the states for coercive purposes. It is an attempt to dominate all of life, every aspect of it. It's an aggression against neighbors. And finally, it's a cosmic confrontation with the West. As Tony Blair put it in August of 2006, quote, "We are fighting a war, but not just against terrorism, but about how the world should govern itself in the early 21st century, about global values," unquote. Now, how does one respond to this? The mayor is a man of the left, and I am a classical liberal. We can agree that neither of us personally wishes to be subjected to the Sharia. I assume you will correct me if I'm wrong. But neither of us want this as part of our personal life. But our views diverge sharply on how to respond to this phenomenon. Those of my political outlook are alarmed by Islamist advances in the West. Much of the left approaches the topic in a far more relaxed fashion. Why this difference? Why generally is the right alarmed and the left much more sanguine? There are many differences, but there are many reasons, but I'd like to focus on two. One is the sense of shared opponents between the Islamists and those on the left. George Galloway explained in 2005 that, quote, "The progressive movement around the world and the Muslims have the same enemies," which he then went on to indicate were Israel, the United States, and Great Britain. And if you listen to the words that are spoken about, say, the United States, you can see that this is in fact the case. Harold Pinter has described America as, quote, "a country run by a bunch of criminal lunatics," unquote. And Osama bin Laden, I'll do what I can to get an applause line. And get ready for this one. And Osama bin Laden called the United States unjust, criminal, and tyrannical. Noam Chomsky termed America a leading terrorist state, and Hafiz Hussein Ahmed, a Pakistani political leader, called it the biggest terrorist state. A lot of common ground. It makes it tempting, I think, for those on the left to make common cause with Islamists. And the symbol of this would be the demonstrations in Hyde Park on the 16th of February 2003, called by a coalition of leftist and Islamist organizations. At other times, the left feels a kinship with Islamist attacks on the West. Forgiving, understanding. See why this would happen. A couple of notorious quotes. The German composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen termed the 9/11 attacks the greatest work of art for the whole cosmos. The American novelist Norman Mailer commented that, quote, "the people who did this were brilliant," unquote. Such attitudes tempt the left not to take seriously the Islamist threat to the West. With John Kerry, former aspirant to the presidency, they dismiss terrorism as a mere, quote, "nuisance," unquote. That's one reason, is the bonds between the two camps. The second is that on the left one finds a tendency to focus on terrorism, not on Islamism, not on radical Islam. Terrorism is blamed on such problems as Western colonialism in past centuries, Western neo-imperialism of the present day, Western policies, particularly in places like Iraq and the Palestinian Authority, or unemployment, poverty, desperation. I would contend that it actually results from an aggressive ideology. I respect the role of ideas, and I believe that not to respect them, to dismiss them, to pay them no attention, is to patronize, and possibly even to be racist. There's no way to appease this ideology. It is serious. There's not an infusion of money there's no amount of money that can solve it. There's no change in foreign policy that could make it go away. I would argue to you, ladies and gentlemen, it must be fought and it must be defeated, as in 1945 and in 1991, as the German and the Soviet threats were defeated. Our goal must be, in this case, the emergence of an Islam that is modern, moderate, democratic, humane, liberal, and good neighborly. One that is respectful of women, homosexuals, atheists, and whoever else. One that grants non-Muslims equal rights with Muslims. In conclusion, Mr. Mayor, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, on the left or on the right, I think you agree with me on the importance of working together to attain such an Islam. I suggest this can be achieved not via the get-along multiculturalism that you proposed, but by standing firm with our civilized allies around the globe, and especially with liberal voices in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with Iranian dissidents, and with reformers in Afghanistan. I also propose standing with their counterparts in the West, with such individuals as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, formerly a Dutch legislator, now in exile in the United States, Irshad Manji, the Canadian author, Wafa Sultan, a Syrian in exile in the United States who made this phenomenal appearance on Al Jazeera, individuals like Magdi Alam, an Egyptian who's now a leading Italian journalist, Nasser Khader, a parliamentarian in Denmark, Salim Mansour, a professor and author in Canada, and Irfan Al-Alawi here in Britain. Conversely, if we do not stand with these individuals, but instead if we stand with those who would torment them, with the Islamists, with, I might say, someone like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, we are then standing with those who justify suicide bombings, who defend the most oppressive forms of Islamic practice, and who espouse a clash of civilizations' viewpoint themselves. To the extent that we all work together against the barbarism of radical Islam, a world civilization does indeed exist, one that transcends skin color, geography, politics, and religion. I hope that you and I, Mr. Mayor, can agree here and now to cooperate on such a program.
Daniel Pikes there. Now, to second the Mayor's point of view, I'd like to call on Councillor Salma Yaqoob.
Having just listened to Daniel Pipes, I can see the appeal of his argument. It's neat, it's simplistic, but I think it's a sinister, self-fulfilling prophecy. Let me explain. You have an analysis that there is this clash of civilization and barbarism, mainly Islamic barbarism, as is outlined. Then you have action based on that analysis, the need for preemptive strikes. This, after all, was the basis for the US attack on Iraq, as they told their own public, with the alleged weapons of mass destruction. And the arguments being used against Iran right now. They pose a threat to us, so we better eliminate that threat. And you see consequences of such actions in the form of a violent backlash, whether in the form of resistance abroad or indeed terrorist atrocities at home. And so finally you have your conclusion with this neat analysis. When reprisal events like 7/7 take place, people like Daniel turn around and say, see, I told you so. I told you they hate us. And then they go on to explain that Muslims are violent towards the West because they hate the Western way of life. And there's something in the Islamic culture that breeds such violence. There is this ideology that's formed within the faith itself. And in this way, the argument of the Islamic threat becomes justified. But I tell you what, I think this is a dishonest argument. The neocons present a problem whose roots are actually political in nature as a problem of culture and faith. The clash theory deliberately distracts from horrific realities. Because the truth is that as a result of Western foreign policy, not just in recent times, but over many, many decades, hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East have been killed. Millions have had their lives destroyed. But their suffering is not acknowledged. Their deaths are not even officially counted. Indeed, their humanity is dismissed with terms like collateral damage. And there are certainly no commemorations or minute silences for these people. The neocons talk about Islamic terrorism, but make no mention of the role of Western state terrorism in being a catalyst for the violence that ensues. I'll tell you what, the irony is that part of the preemptive rationale post 9/11 was supposed to eliminate supposed Islamic terrorist threat, but has in actuality enlarged one. And my interest, as I'm sure as Daniel Pipe's interest is, how do we really reduce the risks that all of us face? I'm not here to apologise or to make appeasement arguments for Islamic terrorism. My interest as a British person, as a woman, as a mom, is to make sure that we all live in a secure and safe world. But what I would argue is that huge wells of despair and hatred have been created in parts of the world where people previously had no quarrel with the West. The truth is that the grim brutality on the ground, as relayed via television and the internet, has a far more radicalising influence than any amount of religious sermons. So I find the premise of Daniel's argument dishonest because of the way it evades completely the history and consequences of Western intervention in the Middle East. I also find it dishonest because this talk of the clash is really an ideological cover designed to mask US plans to remap the Middle East in its own interest and tighten its control over oil reserves. It is nothing more than a weapon of mass destruction for public consumption. However, the world does face some very real threats. Global warming, third world debt, poverty and disease. And the impact of these threats have actually been increased due to the influence of neocon policies. Ironically, the people who shout the loudest about the threat to civilization from Islamists are exactly the same people who, for me, pose the biggest threat to civilization. Whether the issue is resisting the Kyoto Agreement to curb climate change, or institutionalizing third world debt and poverty, or a desperation to send other people's children to wage war, you will see the most vocal advocates being neocons like Daniel Pipes. And what strikes me is when you look at the elites both in the West and in the East, who implement these policies, whether they're based in Washington or London, or whether they're based in Riyadh or Cairo, is that when it comes to putting profits first and humanity second, they are more than capable of overcoming any cultural differences they may have between themselves. So I do not accept that the biggest divide in the world today is between Islamists and the rest. I believe it's between those who advocate the policies of war and neoliberalism and those, the bulk of humanity, who want to live in a world based on peace and social justice.